Hi, I'm Ashton, and today I want to talk about books a bit, because when do I not? So a while back I did a recent leftist reads video back in 2019, which is weird that that's 6 months ago now. I recently finished the 25th book that I've read this year, so I'm halfway done, halfway to my goal, which is 50 books. I'm definitely gonna hit it, I think, hopefully before the end of the year. But I have read 25 books this year. 11 of them have been left-leaning or leftism related. And today I wanted to talk about those books, discuss my thoughts on them, tell you whether or not I would recommend them. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Wanted to clarify real quick why I'm categorizing these books as all left-aligned. Not all of them are explicitly leftist, not all of them are foundational leftist texts like Marx's Capital or anything. As I've been critiqued in the past for relying too much on identity politics and not enough on class consciousness, because at the end of the day, race, gender, sexuality, disability, it literally so many aspects of identity politics play into class, and it's still incredibly fucking important within leftism. So while not all of the books I read are explicitly leftist texts, I think anti-racism 101 type books are still an important thing for leftists to read, especially white leftists. And yeah, sure, a couple of the anti-racist books that I'm including in this video do come from a liberal perspective, but I think regardless of that, it's still important to understand that framework and understand what a lot of Black people are saying. So sure, some of these books aren't explicitly left aligned when it comes to are they based on Marx or whatever, but I think identity politics are still incredibly important when understanding class consciousness and when being on the left in terms of politics, because identity and class, they play together constantly, and if we don't recognize that, then we're just deceiving ourselves. So, not all of these are by Marx or Engels or Lenin, but I wanted to include them anyway because a lot of white leftists do need to read more on race, myself included. That's why I'm talking about them, and that's why I think we should talk about identity within leftist politics, because it's still fucking important, and if you don't recognize that, then that's a you problem. Before I get started on what I have read, I want to talk a bit about books that I am hoping to read that are left-aligned. So I have this one, Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. I haven't read Lenin before, and I feel like I should. I bought it secondhand so that I could make notes in it. I feel like this is going to be one that I want to annotate, so I have this to read. I also have 2 ebooks that I need to get through that I mentioned in, a few videos back. The End of Policing by Alex S. Vitale and Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect, which is an anthology. Both are about policing. So I'll definitely read those 3 books by the end of the year. I'm currently in the middle of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. I have actually since finished How to Be an Anti-Racist. I'm not going to give you my thoughts on it because I think at the end of the year, once I'm done my 50 books, I will give you another the leftist reads that I read in the last 6 months of the year, if you want that. If you like this one, I don't know, we'll see, but yeah, that's on the table. I also have the ebook checked out for The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. So I'll be done reading that within a week. Yeah, those are a few of the books that I'm hoping to read before the end of the year as well, but as for books I've already read, let's talk about those. So I'm going to be going in order from the beginning of the year to what I just finished reading currently. So the first left-aligned book that I read in 2020 was The Responsibility of Intellectuals by Noam Chomsky. This was the first Chomsky writing that I had read outside of a couple shorter essays, I think. And it was a solid okay. It really only took me hour and a half to read, but it was presented to me in book format. My boyfriend's dad bought the book for him, and he hadn't read it, and it was sitting on his shelves, and I was sitting on his floor, and I was like, hey, can I read this? And he was like, yeah. And I read all of it, just sitting on my boyfriend's dorm floor. It was fine, and I do think it's interesting. It definitely gives you a bit of insight as to the political environment of when it was written, and I do think a lot of it still applies today. And I do appreciate his perspective on hey, a bunch of intellectuals and higher-ups are really subservient to power, and it makes sense, but I do wish there was more structural critique in it. I feel like it could easily be expanded upon and be an entire book rather than the length that it is. It was a good critique, but it could have done more. And I don't know if Chomsky's more recent work is any better. I do feel like I need to read more Chomsky before I really judge him as a person or as a philosopher. I would say it's pretty middle of the road. A book that is somewhat similar and was published 1 year later is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is what I would recommend over Chomsky's essay. It's more in the realm of like critical pedagogy than, the responsibility of intellectuals. I do want to read more on the topic of like critical pedagogy. I know Bell Hooks has some work on the topic, and I've read a bit of her work before, and I definitely want to read more of it. I just feel like Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a lot more applicable and has a much like more wide-reaching thesis, I suppose. But I've read about Pedagogy of the Oppressed before, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about Chomsky. But yeah, it was my first Chomsky read, and it was solidly okay. The second left-aligned book that I read this year was an anthology called Queering Anarchism, Addressing and Undressing Power and Desire, edited by C.B. Daring, J. Rogue, Derek Shannon, and Abby Volcano. It's difficult to, like, give a judgment on an anthology because there's so many different, people that go into it. And I've done it before. I did a book review on X Marks the Spot, but I did have a lot more cohesive thoughts about X Marks the Spot, whereas Queering Anarchism, I had a lot of mixed feelings about. There were some essays that I really liked, some that I was super uncomfortable with. I remember I really liked the essay on disability. I really liked the essay on how kink and BDSM can be used for exploring power dynamics. I thought that was really cool. I did not like this one essay about queering heterosexuality, and this is, a much debated topic, I feel like. So it was an essay written by a non-straight identified heterosexual cisgender woman. She used the T slur to describe trans people, which I don't think is good or okay at all. And she also uses queer to describe herself. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with non-cishet people using queer to describe themselves. But when she's literally, like, by her own admission, a cishet person, why would you do that? A lot of it seemed very base level and stuff that I felt like, as someone who's both queer and an anarchist, I kind of already knew. Like, there's an essay in there on prison abolition. I'm a police abolitionist, I'm a prison abolitionist, but to me that essay felt very base level. It felt like an introduction, and that's okay if this book is meant to be an introduction. When I picked it up and I saw the title, like, Queering Anarchism, I was like, oh, a book for anarcho-queers like me, not like, oh, a book for cishets that are already anarchists that need to be more intersectional, I do think I eventually want to buy this book because I do really like some of the essays within it, and I would love to be able to, like, highlight and, mark things down and stuff and have it in my own library. But, like, as an anthology, it just seemed very hit or miss for me. As I said, the thing on disability, great. The thing on using kink as ways to explore power dynamics, I really liked that. Queering heterosexuality, though, I just think, especially in the realm of queer politics, in a book that I think is meant to focus on queer voices, having a cishet woman who calls herself queer and uses the T slur wasn't comfy for me. I think cishet people oftentimes need to learn to stay in their place when it comes to queer politics, and that person doesn't seem like she knows how to do that. I rated it like 3 stars just because it was very, very hit or miss, but I really like some of the essays within it. Moving on from that, the next thing I read was Transliberation, Beyond Pink or Blue by Leslie Feenberg. God, I adored this book. Transliberation is very much like a collection of a lot of different aspects of Feenberg's work. The way that Feenberg defines who is and isn't trans is very interesting and very freeing, I think. The writing in general throughout the book was very liberating. I enjoyed, I think, literally every essay and or speech in that book. It's another book that's on my wish list. I would love to own it. Feenberg is just someone that I think is really influential within queer politics, especially when it comes to more radical queer politics, and I really enjoy their work. Obviously, Leslie's most well-known book probably is Stone Butch Blues. I do want to read that eventually, but I really liked Transliberation. If you're queer, if you like queer history, if you like radical queer politics, read Transliberation. It's beautiful. It is liberating. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. I definitely want to own it someday. The next left-aligned book I read was very disappointing. It was Don't Be Evil, The Case Against Big Tech by Reina Faruhar. The synopsis that Goodreads gives about this book, I'll read it for you. Today, Google and Facebook receive 90% of the world's news ad spending. Amazon takes half of all e-commerce in the US. Google and Apple operating systems run on all but 1% of cell phones globally, and 80% of corporate wealth is now held by 10% of companies. Not the GEs and Toyotas of the world, but the digital titans. How did we get here? How did the tech industry get to dominate our world so completely? How did once idealistic and innovative companies come to manipulate elections, violate our privacy, and pose a threat to the fabric of our democracy? Interesting premise, I think. But the book comes from a very liberal mindset, right? So it's very well researched. It's got a lot of interesting history and statistics about the structure of big tech and what it does, and sometimes where it came from. But I do think it lacks a more critical understanding of capitalism. It's not deconstructing in the way that I wish it was. I would love to read an anti-big tech book about like the ways that technology could be used within a better world, or like a speculative fiction about technology. It kind of excuses the terrible things that tech has done by saying like, well, this isn't capitalism's fault. This is the way that we have capitalism's fault, you know? It kind of says that if we controlled capitalism more, this wouldn't happen. I don't think that's true. You know, I really wanted this to be good, but I shouldn't have expected as much as I did. The synopsis says that she like lays out a plan for how we can resist and create a framework that fosters innovation. And like, okay, but all of that exists under capitalism still. Like the whole thing still excuses capitalism. And to me, as like a leftist who's an anti-capitalist, it just wasn't very enlightening. Like a lot of the stuff that she talked about when it came to the things that big tech does and the way that they take our data and the way that they use our data and the way that different companies monopolize in different areas, it's interesting, but a lot of it is stuff that you know just by existing under capitalism. A lot of it is just stuff you can observe. And while there are a lot of statistics and a lot of well-done research in there that definitely show like a deeper level of it, it just could have been so much more. So many of those statistics could be taken into a way that critiques capitalism, but instead it was just excusing capitalism and saying, well, look how amazing this could be if we reformed capitalism a little bit. I don't know, maybe it's just because this book isn't as like left aligned as I thought it might be from the synopsis, but it was disappointing to me. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it. Maybe if you know absolutely nothing about the world of big tech, it might teach you a little bit. But if you're looking for an analysis of how capitalism corrupts innovative and interesting things, this is not it. So let's move on to a much better book. So you want to talk about Race by Ajoma Oluo. I've talked about this book before, so I'm not going to talk about it too much right now. You all know that I really, really loved this book. I've recommended So You Want to Talk About Race to like everybody I've talked to in the past few months. It's just really well done. It's an incredible primer on a lot of modern issues surrounding race. I think especially right now it's really good. It's just really insightful. It's really well researched. It's really well written. Like I can't complain about it. So I'm just gonna move on. The next book I read was like an integral one that I think everyone should read again. The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. This is another one that I recommend to literally everyone. It was published back in 2010, but so much of it is still incredibly relevant, and I think it provides a really, really useful framework when discussing prison abolition. If you don't believe that the system of incarceration we have is racist, this is a great book to convince you otherwise. It's also a good one to recommend to any family members that don't necessarily believe that. It's another one that I would love to have on my shelves because I feel like there are just so many really, really good bits of information in there that I could mark up and highlight and pull out when I need to argue with someone. So regardless of it being 10 years old now, it's still an incredibly relevant book. I would still definitely recommend reading it, especially if you're an anti-racist in the United States, because it mainly does focus on the US's mass incarceration problems and why they're racist and what they stem from and how the policies still impact it to this day. And it's really well done. It's full of statistics. It's full of analysis. It's good. Doing a complete 180, the next book I read, I'm not sure if it was supposed to be, no, it was supposed to be left aligned because it came from like a somewhat Marxist framework. But anyways, the next book I read was White Trash: The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America by Nancy Eisenberg. This was a book that I wanted to be good because I think class is a very like under-discussed thing within liberal politics. Obviously, there are racialized aspects of class, but I think more than discussing them as they exist, it's important to deconstruct why they exist and how they came to exist. And this does provide, you know, quite a extensive history, and it is informative, but it lacks analysis. It really lacks analysis. And, you know, I'm someone that prefers analytical books to like straight history, and maybe that's on me. I also just really didn't enjoy the writing style. It was very lackluster, kind of boring. I wish I knew better how to word it, but I had a lot of issues with how this book represents race. It kind of presents whiteness as another aspect to the white underclass's oppression. They aren't being oppressed for being white. You know, white people are not oppressed for being white. That's just not how it works. I just feel like it could have been so much better, and I craved any sort of like cause and effect or discussion of larger trends rather than like just anecdotes. But then on top of that, the author is a white woman, and there are a lot of N-words in this book, okay? An incredibly large, uncomfortable amount of N-words, as well as a few other slurs if I remember correctly. So I didn't like that a lot. Obviously, I know there's the argument for using slurs in their historical context and when it's in quotes and stuff, but like, Could you not use a different quote? Is it that difficult? Let's do a complete 180 again and talk about why I'm no longer talking to white people about race by Rennie Edo Lodge. Popping in again to say that, well, everything that I said about this book I think still applies. I watched a 3-year-old philosophytube video reviewing this book as well. I'm gonna link that down below because it points out a couple important things about anti-Semitism that I didn't talk about. I would still recommend that you read the book, but I think that you should watch that video first. It doesn't spoil anything, you'll be fine. But yeah. So I do feel like this is more targeted towards the UK and Britain because Rennie Edo Lodge is a British black woman, and a lot of the history that's included in this book and a lot of the discussion of larger trends are more related to British racism than the racism that happens in America. But a lot of it still does translate, and I do think it's still important to understand racism on the other side of the sea. This is another book that I would really recommend to any white person that wants to be an anti-racist or considers themselves one already. I learned a lot from it. And I think you probably would too. I also think it definitely says something that literally every 1 and 2-star review of this book is a white person being like, I'm very offended by the fact that she won't talk to white people about race. Because if you read the first fucking chapter, you'll understand why you shouldn't say shit like that. Anyways, it's good. If you're white and you live in Britain, read it, okay? If you're white and you live in America, but you consider yourself an anti-racist, or you want to be an anti-racist, or you want to understand a different place's perspective on race and the racist issues that happen in the UK, I do feel like sometimes in America, white people will say, oh, racism is a US problem, very much concentrated within the US, and that's just not true. And this book is a really good exploration of that. It's a really good discussion on whiteness and anti-racism, and it's really well done. I think everyone should read it. Especially white people, contrary to the title. As long as you have an open mind, I think you're going to learn something. I'm telling you, literally every negative review of this book is from a racist person. You can go on Goodreads and look at it. It's horrifying. Mostly, obviously, this book focused on race, but there were also definitely aspects of intersectionality between race and class and race and gender. It could have probably benefited more from LGBT perspectives. Every book could be better. Every book could be more intersectional, but this is a good book. It's also another one that I would really like a copy of someday. All right, we're getting there. I only have a few more. Next book I read after that, well, I read Gay Berlin, then I read Interview with a Vampire, but next leftist book I read after that was Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. This is a book that everyone should read because it's free online. It's 120 pages. It took me under 2 hours. I promise you can read it. This is your primer to prison abolition. Once again, if you have an open mind, I think you'll learn something. In one of my recent videos, one where I talk to white people, the link to the full PDF of the book is in the description. It's also all over the internet. You can probably look it up and find it. But I would highly recommend Our Prisons Obsolete. It's a quick read. It's very beginner friendly. Everyone should read it. And that is all I will say. Next Left Aligned book I read after that was Sister Outsider, Essays and Speeches by Audre Lorde. I'd read a bit of Audre Lorde's poetry before, but I'd never delved into her prose. And I cannot recommend this book enough. Audre Lorde is incredibly influential in Black feminism and in queer feminism. Audre Lorde is incredibly inspiring, and her work is so beautiful, both her poetry and her prose and all of her speeches. And this is another book that I would really love to own, not necessarily even because I want to mark it up and highlight things that I love, just because I just want to read these essays over and over again. It's very much not a Racism 101 book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race or So You Want to Talk About Race are, but it's still really good. And if you think you're past the 101, read some Audre Lorde. Oh my god. Some of my favorites. Some of them. I really liked every essay, but I really liked Poetry is Not a Luxury. I liked The Transformation of Silence. I really liked Uses of the Erotic. The Open Letter to Mary Daly was top tier. That was one of my favorites. The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House I thought was incredibly well done, and I also think it's probably one of the most influential essays in this book. Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism was really good, and I also really liked Learning from the 60s. Every single essay in this book I really, really enjoyed, but those were just some that stood out to me, even though that's half of the essays. But yeah, read Sister Outsider, read Audre Lorde in general. Obviously I'm very different from Audre Lorde as a person within my identities, but this book just made me feel very connected to a lot of her politics, and it filled me with warmth and hope and inspiration. So I really love Audre Lorde's work, and I'm excited to read more of it. Okay, very last one is one that I read in one sitting. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Popping in to correct myself real quick, his name is actually pronounced Ta-Nehisi. It's a series of essays presented as letters towards his son. It's about being Black in America and the Black body, a bit about his history and what he hopes for his son's future, and it is some of the most personal and raw, yet powerful and very, like, it feels like it understands so much. It was published in 2015, but again, I think it's still incredibly relevant today. It's so well done. It's definitely a very unique book. The style of its writing is probably not for everyone, but I think you should give it a shot. It's relatively short. I'm sorry, that was me talking about 11 books that I recently read. It was a bit rambly, it was a bit all over the place, but some of you enjoy book content, and I enjoy making it, and I wanted to rant about books, so that's what I did. It's 11 p.m. I'm going to go get some water and probably go to bed in a few hours after either editing this video or reading more. I'm probably gonna read more. So yeah, those were the 11 Left Aligned books that I read out of the 25 books that I've read so far this year. Hopefully I'll read at least 11 more. I hope that you got either some book recommendations from me in this video, or if you've already read some of these books and you want to talk about them with me, please talk about them. No one in my life reads enough. Leftist lit. This is a call out to my friends. Please read more books so that I can rant to you about them without, like, spoiling things. Sorry I went through all of this so chaotically and without really any structure, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. Let me know if you read any of these or if you have read any of these, because I'd love to talk about them. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to me ramble about left-aligned books that I enjoyed or not enjoyed. And I'm sorry for being maybe too harsh on some of them, but I hope you enjoyed this video anyway, and I'll talk to you later. Maybe.